All right. Okay, so welcome everyone again. So for those of you who had just trickled in, welcome. And then for those of you who tuned in a couple minutes early, just wanted to welcome you again. So if you wanted to put your information down on the chat, your name, your company, the industry that you're under, and also the city that you're in, so then we can get to know you better. And then you can get to know the other people who are part of this webinar as well. So this is session 2 of our Meet Our Procurement Experts. And session 2 is we'll be talking about the strategies for creating a budget for your government proposals. And I just wanted to let you know that this is the second session. The first session was last week. So last week was on professional services. So we had one of our colleagues talk about how to source contracting opportunities and using a case study that's our professional services. And then this is session 2. We're talking about budgets. And then session 3 next week will be another good one. It is how to strengthen your loan application and what the lenders are looking for. So then make sure that you don't miss that one as well. And again, welcome to our session today, and we will get started. Okay, just a few housekeeping items. So first of all, make sure you're on listening mode. And then please use the raise hand function if you'd like to unmute and ask questions. Although I think we'll have a lot of time later on to respond to questions, and I'll try to respond to them as much as I can. And if I don't know the answers, I will get back to you after this. And then use the Q&A function to post questions. You can post questions on the chat. I may just miss them, so it's a little bit easier to keep track of it on the Q&A. And then also we will have webinar recordings. I think that was one question we had on the chat. Let's see, it is there a recording to play back from the last one? So we do. I believe, I'm not sure if it's up yet. However, once it's up, it will be on the PACE website. But what I'll do is after the session, I usually will send out a follow-up email, and I will put the recording link there as well. So you can catch up on that one. And then also there will be a survey once the webinar ends. So if you can just, take about a minute or so to answer that survey, that would be great. Okay. All right. And just a little bit of introduction about PACE. So some of you may have been attending PACE webinars for a while. And for that one, we're grateful to have you here. And for those of you who are new and don't know much about PACE, PACE stands for Pacific Asian Consortium and Employment. And we are a nonprofit based in downtown LA and have been around since the early 70s. And PACE has also a business development center, which started in the 90s, and that's to help out business owners like you on different types of services, such as one-on-one consulting, entrepreneurship training programs. We do have a lot of business courses and then also webinars like this. And then we also have business financing, a lot of access to capital. So whether it's grants, I do a monthly grant workshop. And then we also are a CDFI, so Community Development Financial Institutions, which means we can lend money, both internally through ours or through a network of partners that we partner up with depending on the amount of the loan. And then we are also, I am part of the procurement team. So we are working right now with ProcureLA, which is the procurement arm for the mayor's office, with some of the big events that are going on in LA, such as the Olympics, FIFA, and then the NFL. And so if you do have any questions regarding procurement, feel free to ask me or ask one of us here at PACE on how to get onto ProcureLA. Okay. Okay, and this is just an example of the agenda of what we're going to go through today. So we will have, I'll try to get through it as much as I can. And then if we do go over or we don't have enough time, then what I'll do is I'll send out the slides and then I'll link to the recording. So session 1 will be the role of budgeting in government proposals. Why it's important to have a budget. Second one would be the elements excuse me, of a government proposal budget. What are the key things that you should look out for? And then third one would be understanding the financials and the cost structure of the budget. Section 4 will be best practices that I've seen in preparing one, and then section 5 will be some of the red flags and common mistakes that I've seen in some of the budgets that I've looked into. Okay. So poll one, so like I just wanted to make this a little bit more interactive. So on the chat function, I just wanted to know what part of the budget prep is most confusing or intimidating to you. So for those of you who have done government proposals or none, or for those of you who are looking into it or have heard something, what do you think? What part of the budget prep is most confusing or intimidating? Or one thing you wanted to learn more about. Yes, feel free to chime on the chat, and then I just wanted to know your opinion. Okay. And as you're doing that, I'm just going to go ahead and start the agenda. So first one section is what is the role of budgeting in government proposals, right? Yeah, so when we talk about budgeting in a greater sense, budgeting is really more than numbers. It's storytelling with figures. So you have these figures, maybe in Excel and then numbers for a lot of people. If it's just the numbers, it doesn't make sense, right? But what it is, it's you're telling a story with the numbers and the figures that you have in the budget. So it tells you the story of how you will bring your project to life. And so when you think of budgeting, I guess it makes it a little bit more exciting, right? A little bit more interesting when you think of budgeting as not just purely numbers, but it's the narrative plus the numbers. So the best proposals have budgets that mirror and reinforce the written plan. So if you, for example, you mentioned that community engagement will be three times in your, if you mentioned community engagement three times in your scope, of the proposal, but don't budget for outreach or staff time, then reviewers will notice, and that will be a red flag. So either you have to change the narrative or you have to change the numbers that are in your budget to reflect the narrative. Okay. So one tip here that I've seen is that make sure you think of your budget as more of a financial blueprint that supports the architecture of your proposal. So as we said before, budgeting is more than just the numbers. It's really you telling a story with the numbers and the figures that you have. Okay. And then the second thing is that making sure that the budget aligns with the scope of work, your timeline, and your deliverables. So SOW or your scope of work, when you look at a proposal, there's a scope of work, right? You tell them, okay, these are the services that they want, and what would be your scope of work. So that really drives your budget. So each major task or deliverables in your scope of work should have some corresponding cost in the budget. Otherwise, there is some sort of miscommunication or misalignment if you don't do that. And then the timeline matters. If your project spans multiple phases or years, your budget should also show you the expenses and how they're distributed over time. So for example, if your project says, is it 1 year? Or is your scope 2 years or 3 years? So make sure that your budget really reflects that timeline. And then the third one is deliverable alignment. So if you're being paid per milestone, instead, let's say milestone one, let's say construction work part one, and then part two, part three, ensure that each deliverable has a clearly defined cost basis, such as labor hours, materials, and then travel, etc., overhead. And we'll talk about those expenses later. Okay. So just a quick example on this, on the alignment. So let's say if your scope of work says, okay, let's go back to, let's say the proposal says we need some event management, and that's the scope of work. And then one of the things in your scope says, I'm gonna host 5 community workshops over 6 months. So then you have to make sure that your budget clearly includes some of the staff time for preparation and facilitation, your space rental or virtual platform costs like Zoom or Google Meet or Teams, any printing materials and food if applicable, and any marketing and outreach costs. So as you can see here, one thing that's really important to see is that as you know, we go back to the storytelling, right? So I think that makes budgeting a little bit more exciting beyond the numbers, is that your budget really aligns with your scope of work. And then also, another one would be understanding how the procurement is evaluated, the criteria, and also the realism, or how realistic the costs are. So cost realism is a concept that agencies want to know that your budget is neither too high or too low for the scope of work. So if it's unrealistic pricing, it raises a lot of red flags about your ability to perform. So if you are either too high or too low, there's going to be that question of, let's say if it's too low, how can you achieve what you're seeking to do with the cost that you presented or the expenses, right? So there's got to be some sort of realism involved in it. And then also the other one is how reasonable the cost is. So reasonableness ensures that your prices are in line with the market norms or comparable contracts. So that's why if you are a procurement officer who's been looking at contracts day in and day out and looking at proposals, and if you know, usually, I would say you would have some sort of range on the price, right? Or the cost. So if it's something that's too high or too low, it will stick out, and there will be a little bit of, you know, a lot of questioning on why it's out of line within the general scope of where the range should be. And some solicitations require a cost narrative to explain how you arrived at each figure. So make sure that this adds content and transparency to the costs that you have. All right. Some of the red flags that I've seen and we've mentioned here before is evaluators look for are you underbidding, right? Are you underbidding to win the contract without understanding the scope? So let's say if you have a scope of work that is for 2 years, and then they see that you know that it's been underbidded 20 or 30%. There's that question of, can you really perform the contract? Do you have enough staff? Do you have enough budget for the staff? And if you've underbid, and then you realize, the other question would be, you know, they want to make sure that you don't go bankrupt, right? Like, let's say if they do accept your bid or your proposal to do a multi-year contract, they want to make sure that you're around the second year and actually hadn't gone bankrupt, so then you can continue the work for the second year. So that's why, you know, they want to make sure that there's no underbidding. Second one is overbidding. So overinflated costs that with no justification. And then third one would be lack of detail or some unclear cost assumption. So make sure that you are clear on what the costs are. And then no alignment with labor classification or some prevailing wage rates if required. So this is the same thing, right? It's all about, as you mentioned, the narrative part plus the numbers, and it's all about telling the story of using numbers when you do the budgeting. So one tip that I recommend is that if the solicitation provides historical pricing or some sort of budget range, please reference that when structuring your costs, right? Totally makes sense. Just to make sure that you are primed to win as many contracts as you can. Okay. So before I go to the before I go to the second section, I just wanted to pause a little bit and see if there are any questions. I haven't seen any on the chat or on the Q&A. So I'll just give about a minute to see if I see any questions. If not, we'll go on to the second section. Okay. All right. Okay, good. I know that, but the numbers in Excel and budgeting can be such a snoozy topic. So I'm trying to make it as interesting and maybe as interactive with everyone here. So let's go on to the second section. Okay. So now that we've gone, you know, just a little bit of overview on budgeting, next we'll go over the key elements of a government proposal budget, right? So just a show of hands here, who here has proposed has responded to a request for proposal for a government agency. And then, yes, that's the first question. And second is that how have you found the budgeting section to be? Just a show of hands or responding on the chat. I wanted to know how everyone, yeah, where everyone here is with regards to responding to proposals. Okay. Oh, good. So it says someone is in the process of responding to an RFI. Good. Okay. It seems like a few of you have had, um, there you go. Okay. All right. Okay. I'm just looking through here. Yeah, first of all, thank you for introducing yourselves. I didn't see all this chat earlier, but yes, thank you. It seems like most of you are from California, different places, and it seems like some of you have I've recognized your names from previous workshops. So thank you for attending. Thank you and for keeping on supporting us. And yes, question, yes. So yes, you can get the recording from last week. And let me see. And knowing how to snippet. Okay. Yes, it seems like some of you have talked about the issues here. Yes, it's basically establishing a budget without historical data. Yes, so we'll talk about that a little bit. Knowing how to submit all required paperwork. Yes, that could be a pain because there could be a lot of paperwork involved. Yes, so some of you have had no experience yet. So we'll make sure that we'll provide you enough information so that when you do see a budget, you'll be ready for it. Knowing how to create a good proposal without having previous experience or history of proposing, yes, yeah, that is a common thing. And then, are there any guidelines on budgeting resources that the state uses? Yeah, we'll talk about that later on. And if I'll provide some resources on that one. Yeah, so it seems of you, a lot of you have been responding or have prepared a couple. Yes, it is complex and burdensome, and it can be frustrating, unnecessarily complicated, not clear cut, and time consuming. Yes, those are some of the yeah, you're not alone there. But one of the things is I want to make sure that, hopefully I can simplify some of the budgeting things here. Okay. Okay, so let's go to the second section. So for those of you who haven't seen a budget before, let me know if you have any questions on this. And then for those of you who have seen one, so yeah, I just wanted to reiterate some of the sections here that you may have seen or may have encountered. So first one is I wanted to do a general breakdown of the budget sections. So budget section. So first one are direct labor costs. So that one is fairly easy to understand. So let's say you are in construction, right? So then your direct labor costs are fairly easy, I would say. The components are easy to understand, or the math is anyway. So it's the hours times the rate. So these are the wages for employees or owners directly performing the work, right? So let's say if you're construction, it could be the foreman, it could be the other construction people. And then how to calculate. So this is really easy to calculate. It's estimating the number of hours required for each role or task, and then multiplying it by the hourly rate. So which is based on the actual pay or reasonable market rate. So those are the things, right? And then one of the tips that I actually use to calculate this is include job titles, making sure that you have project management, admin, support, and not just general terms like staff. So even though the math is simple, the assumptions that go beyond the math can be a little bit frustrating to find. So first of all is estimating the hours required. So that one could be a function of a historical data. If let's say if this type of job is something that you've seen before, then you're estimating hours based on some sort of historical data, and then you may have a little bit of cushion on that one depending on, or adjustment depending on how the previous ones had worked. And then the hourly rate, so hourly rate, it could be the actual hourly rate or reasonable market rate. So how do you find the market rate? So some of the resources that I have seen would be, or what I've used is looking at two things. One is looking at salary.com, And through salary.com, what you're able to do is you're able to put the title. You're able to put, I believe maybe not in the free, I think you can also do it in the free function or free trial, is that you're able to find the geographic location. So let's say you're looking for a construction foreman or a construction project manager, that is within the city of LA or the county of LA. They will have some sort of range there. And then if it is somewhere in, let's say, Riverside County, the range may be a little bit different based on the geographic location. I also look at something called the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they also have information on salary there as well. Okay. And then the other one is fringe benefits. So now that you have the direct rate, right? So you have the labor rate, which is the number of hours plus, multiplied by the hourly rate. Now you have to talk about fringe benefits if this is something that your company offers. So fringe benefits are the employer paid expenses like health insurance. It could be retirement contributions like a contribution and a 401k, and then payroll taxes. So this is just, I would say, a quick and dirty way to apply the fringe benefits. But what I've seen so far is that it's commonly applied as a percentage of direct labor costs. So let's say if your direct labor cost is $100 per hour, so then what you do is you apply about 25 to 35% of that one. So yeah, so usually I've seen about in the middle of this, about 30%. So let's say if your hourly rate is $100, then your hourly rate plus the fringe benefit would be $130. So then you multiply it by 30%. So tip is use your actual company fringe rate or the industry averages if you're small or new. So this is another thing. How much should the fringe benefits be? So you can look historically at what you've done. And then the other thing is you can also look at industry averages. I would just say, Google what would be the industry average for construction or event marketing or professional services. Okay. So the other part of a budget would be materials and supplies. So this one, so depending on how intensive your project is, or the proposal that you're bidding on, this could be a big part of your budget and could easily be misapplied. So these are tangible items that are needed to complete the project. So, even if you're doing professional services, for example, where you don't have a lot of materials or supplies, it could be even as small as your paper, your printing, software licenses, etc. Right? And then as you may notice, then the bigger ones, the projects that are labor intensive or material intensive, like construction, this would be a bigger part of their budget. So the tip is to be specific and realistic. Don't forget about admin supplies or any outreach materials. It's easy to forget some of the small things, right? The ones that we say, oh, it could be cents here and there, but make sure that you calculate that, and then also, and don't underbid on the projects. And so some examples of this would be, let's say if you're doing an event, how many, the printing costs, number of flyers plus how much each flyer is. And then also like laptops, if it's project specific and allowable. So as you can see, so on the chat, feel free to, let's say if you're in an industry that is material intensive, I would like to know if you're in that type of industry, and then whether this is something that has been cumbersome to you to break down, right? Especially since now, as I mentioned, or I didn't mention, with the tariffs, for example, that are coming in from overseas goods, and then if you are buying materials overseas, so this could be something that's a little bit harder to budget for, right? Okay. Okay, and then before I go, I think I had seen some questions I wanted to respond to. Um, okay, it says, if you don't have fringe benefits, can you add them for the RFP only? You know what? This is the good question, but I think is that you you know, I wouldn't say you don't have fringe benefits. You may have de minimis fringe benefits, right? So you may not give, for example, you don't have you don't have a 401k plan or any of the other, let's say you don't, you don't provide health insurance and stuff like that. But I believe that you should at least add some sort of de minimis, like, or just the minimum amount of fringe benefits, so then you can at least cover your bases later on, and then give you a little bit of cushion. And then, is it acceptable to add a force majeure clause as part of the budgeting process to protect against unforeseen costs such as tariffs or unusually large increases in minimum wage? You know what? Great question. So I have never and I've never seen one, but I don't know if this is something that are part of different contracts. So basically, a force majeure clause is, let's say something happens, like an event that is unexpected, and you have some unforeseen costs, right? So for example, like a large increase there, there was there's a tornado or some sort of natural disaster that happened, and then you had to add logistic costs and stuff like that. So this is something I haven't seen before as added to a clause. However, what I can say is you can probably go back to, once you've gotten awarded the contract and then you see that there's something unusual that happened, I think it may make sense to go back to whoever gave you the contract and say, hey, you know what, this happened, right? And then see if you can work through the issue that way. But great question. Okay, so another part of a budget section would be travel, and this one may or may not be relevant to many of you, but these are costs related to travel required by the contract. So let's say if you have any site visits or meetings or anything like that. So some of the expenses that are included or information that you may need to put would be the purpose of the travel, the number of trips that you've taken, the per diem, the mileage or the airfare, and anything else that could be related to that travel, right? And so the one tip is that refer to the federal per diem rates if the contract is federally funded. So, for example, usually there's some sort of per diem rates that are required for someone who's traveling, which includes some meals and then lodging. Okay, the other part of a budget section would be subcontractor costs. So these are work that's being performed by another business or a consultant that is under your lead. So this can include the name of the subcontractor, the description of the services, and also the lump sum or the hourly breakdown. So one tip here is that if you may be required to submit a subcontractor quote or some sort of rate justification if this is a cost that you're including in your budget. Okay. Then another budget section would be equipment rental. So as I said, this could be something that may or may not be relevant to you or some industries. This could be more prevalent as a bigger part of their budget, let's say construction or engineering, right? So these are project-specific equipment purchases or rentals that is not for general use. So it's important that they must be necessarily and allowable for that project. And one tip that I say is show whether it's a one-time cost or some sort of prorated rental. So, for example, if this is relevant, if it's a project that you're doing multi-year, right? Are you gonna be renting this equipment? Let's say it's a printer, right? Is this something that you're gonna be renting one time, or is it something that will be prorated and you're gonna be renting it, let's say, for every 6 months, right? So just one thing that you wanted to show as part of your narrative. And then the other cost would be indirect costs. So indirect costs would be things like overhead. So this is akin to something like overhead. So these are your organization's general administrative costs, such as the rent, utilities, accounting, HR, that support the project, but the proposal or the scope of work that you're doing, but aren't necessarily tied to a specific task. So this is usually applied as a percentage of direct costs. And one thing I've seen is that this direct costs, this percentage can vary based on the industry. Okay. All right. Okay, and then I just wanted to see, so someone had raised their hand before I go. Do you want to put your question down on the chat for whoever raised their hand, and then I'll get back to it. All right. So some other part of the budget section would be profit, right? So this is one thing we want to hear. Okay, let's see. Yes, so after indirect costs, we have, there you go, the profit. So profit is the fee or the markup that is included for a corporation or for-profit entity. So some common ranges depending on the industry would be 5 to 10% of the total direct cost, but it really depends on the industry, right? And then they must be reasonable and clearly stated. So one tip that I put here is make sure that you check the solicitation or the proposal carefully. And some RFP specifically could exclude profit. So just make sure that it's something that, yeah, just make sure you read the RFP, right? And make sure that this is something that they mentioned. Okay. Okay, Paul. So I wanted to know your opinion. So which one of these categories do you struggle with when preparing your budget? So we have many different components, right? We have the direct labor, we have the fringe benefit, we have the indirect cost, which is the overhead, we have the profit, subcontractor costs, and then some other operating expenses like travel. So I just wanted to know, for those of you who had done a proposal before, which one of these categories do you struggle with when you've prepared your budgets? Overhead, okay. Yes, overhead is overhead is something that people struggle with because well, first of all, since it's an indirect, one of the things that's hard is to figure out which ones could be allocated to a project, right? So there are little things that may, for example, de minimis overhead expenses that you may not even think of, and it could be cents here, dollar there, but then it could add up if you don't add enough of the expenses of the overhead expenses. Reporting labor. And then for labor, are you talking about more of the direct labor? Like, and then would your issue be on the number of hours or is it the labor rate? Yeah, I think this is for Suzanne. Oh, gathering hours. Okay. So for gathering the hours, and then, I want to talk to you more about that one. Would that be for what industry that you're having issues on with gathering hours? Yes, yes, exactly. So here I'm just looking at the chat. So one of the categories that someone is struggling with would be reporting labor. If they're gathering the hours, especially when you're doing multiple projects. Yeah, so for tech companies, so one of the things I've actually started using or I've looked before would be, and you may be familiar with this, would be some sort of app that tracks the hours. So I've actually discovered this app called Clockify, which if you are doing some sort of billable hours, it's very easy to say, okay, this is my project or this is my client. And then you can put down the number of hours and then it tracks it by, I'm trying to, yeah, it tracks it by obviously the time, the date, the number of hours, and then also you can put a description. So depending, yeah, so if you're in the tech industry, this may be something that you may want to look into. And this is a very easy way, especially if it's an app and you're on the field. It's easy to clock in hours. Okay. Okay. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that one. It's good to know what people are struggling with. Alrighty. Okay. So now we'll talk about more on understanding the financials and the cost structure of the budget. So what is the difference? So for those of you who have looked at budgets before, you may have encountered the difference between fixed and variable costs, right? And for those of you who are new topic, this is a topic that's new to you. I'm gonna just try to break it down as very simple as possible. So basically, fixed costs are the ones that stay the same regardless of how much work you do. So you could be doing, and to a certain extent, right? Because you can always argue that, for example, if you do, let's say you're doing something in printing and your rent, right? So here I say fixed cost is the rent because you're gonna be, if you print five versus you print 5,000, your rent will most likely stay the same if the current office that you have or the factory that you have can accommodate up to 5,000. But let's say if you do have to go up like that, then you may want to, then there may be some other costs involved with renting additional space and stuff like that. But in general, rent is a fixed cost, insurance could be a fixed cost, and salaries of the admin staff could be a fixed cost, such as, and then also subscriptions, right? These are fairly fixed costs. If your yeah, if your job scope is the same regardless of how much work you do to a certain extent. And then variable costs are those ones that change depending on the level of output or activity. So for example, like we've seen here, the contract labor. So if you're doing a project versus multiple projects, that's something that will change the number of hours, that function of the number of hours times the rate. So the number of hours will change. Printing could stay, printing will be a variable cost, materials, fuel, anything like that, and then travel. Okay. Okay, someone had asked, so going back, what is the name of the app again? And this is an app for tracking the labor. So it's called Clockify. So and I'm just going to make sure I spell it correctly. So it's clock and then IFY. So Clockify. But I know there are other ones, but this is the one that I've recently been using because it's just very simple to use and it's free. Some of them require that you have to pay. And then once I get the chance, I'll try to put it on the chat as well. Okay. So just this is just a visual representation of fixed versus variable costs and some examples. So as I said, fixed costs are the rent, the salaries, insurance, and then utilities to a certain extent, right? And then variable could be materials, hourly wages that are with labor related, shipping costs, sales, and then also commission. So right now it's very easy to kind of to get a representation of fixed versus variable costs. So why does it matter for procurement proposals, right? Because first of all, knowing the difference between fixed and variable costs will help you forecast in some sort of accuracy, depending on the size and the scale of your project. So if you know that this is a fixed cost, then the project, then that cost may or may, most likely not change. With that project. And then variable costs, for example, like labor, that that's something that would change. So fixed costs may be recouped. So this is something that I've seen before, that fixed costs may be recouped versus some sort of indirect costs, and then variable costs are often direct and then line item. Okay. So this is just kind of just a very simple formula to calculate the true cost of doing business, right? So it's just, and then the true cost for me is just a matter of putting in all the costs that are related to the project. And so it's the direct costs. We've talked about that. The fringe benefits. So if you have the labor, you add the fringe benefits, would be about 25 to 30%. The indirect costs, right? And then any risk margin, and that could be part of the profit. I'll give you just maybe a couple seconds to take a screenshot of this. Okay. All right. Yeah, and and then I just want to reiterate what are the descriptions or what are the components of the true costs. And then some examples. So for example, the true cost is first is indirect cost. So that could be the labor, materials, project specific expenses, right? And then the fringe benefits would be the labor cost, whatever percentage that you're giving to your employees as part of the labor cost. So this could be when you're paying your taxes, insurance that's related to the employee, and then any retirement, any benefits, right? Even vacation time or medical benefits and stuff like that. That's a fringe benefit. So that one, as I mentioned before, you calculate it based on your, let's say, hourly labor rate, let's say $100 per hour. And then if your fringe benefit is about 30%, then you add 30%. So your true cost of that labor for labor costs would be $130. And then indirect costs are the ones that are not directly related to the project, but then they still contribute to the cost of it, such as admin staff, rent, accounting, general support expenses. And then we talked about the risk margin or the profit, because you do want to make some sort of profit margin. So these are especially for profit entities to account for uncertainty or some sort of competitive pricing, though that's the risk margin portion. So just a quick tip here. So many small businesses underbid because they forget to include indirect costs and fringe. So then it makes it harder to deliver successfully or leads to taking a loss. And so that's something that we don't want to happen, right? So even if, let's say you really, really want to get that contract, but if it's a multi-year contract, how, first of all, is you don't want to take a loss just to get the contract. And then if you do take a loss, either, you're not going to be able to deliver that contract successfully, or you may undercut some things about the contract. And then what happens is that, it could ruin your chances of working with that agency again, or or risking your reputation. So the budget is very, very important. So you have to make sure that you do not underbid because because you wanted to get the contract. So make sure you include, as I mentioned before, the true costs, right? So the direct cost, labor, the direct cost of fringe benefit, indirect costs, and then some sort of profit margin. Yeah, so this is a comment on risk margin can also be changing the cost of direct costs due to tariffs and changes in supply. Yes, yes, example. So I consider this almost some sort of cushion, right? So let's say, so can you just imagine, for example, if you're bidding on a contract that happened, let's say you submitted it December 2024, and now 3 or 4 months, back then you may or may not have anticipated the true cost of the tariffs or the other things that are going on logistically. So if you do have some sort of risk margin or profit margin, that's something that you can kind of tap into, so you're not, you're not going to be risking a big loss. Yeah, great comment on that. Okay. So, Paul, I wanted to ask your opinion. So, when you price a project now, do you include all these costs? And if not, what's missing? Or let's say you had priced a project even before, right? Historically, let's say you priced a project. How have you done? Have you included all this cost? And then what do you think? And if you hadn't, what was missing? What was the thing that you had missed when you were doing this? Ah, okay. Someone said risk margin. Yes, risk margin is a little bit, because then you say, okay, how much risk margin do I put into it, right? So part of it is actually kind of uh looking at it historically, if you've done it before, and then also it could be looking at some bids that have won already. So under the Freedom of Information Act, if there is a bid that's similar to yours, let's say it's within the very similar industry or even the similar scope of services, you can actually request the winning proposal, and then you can say, okay, how much risk margin did they put for that industry? But this is something that you can also, I would say, chat GTP or Google and say, what is a typical profit margin for some sort of industry? And some industries have larger profit margins than others, just historically. So if you're a distribution company, your risk margin, I'm sorry, your profit margin are fairly low, depending, compared it to a, let's say, professional services. So you just have to know what your industry can bear at this point. Okay. Okay, so there's this comment here. It says the project this person has done is just a total amount that includes everything, and I have to figure out if it'll be profitable for me. Yeah, so with this one, I think, Dora, what I wanted to know, what type of industry you're in and the projects that you've done. And then I wanted to know how easy or how hard has it been for you to figure out whether it was profitable or not. Right. Okay. But here it seems like out of all the costs are very straightforward. I think the only thing that's really missing or the people have a hard time on is the profit margin, right? Either the profit margin or the risk margin. Okay. So then financial statements, it's really important also to look at your financial statements that you'll use in order to find your budget, right? So some of the financial statements that I forgot to list here that I'm sure you've seen whether on on QuickBooks or some sort of accounting software, your balance sheet. So looking at your assets, your liabilities and your equity, and then also your profit and loss statement. So looking at, your obviously your revenue, your expenses, and then your operating margin. So you can look at your expenses, and then you can figure out historically how much you have budgeted, let's say for marketing, or how much you've budgeted for labor. It can, and then if you do the analysis on the margins, you can see that, let's say historically on some sort of project like this, you've spent, just to give you an example, 30% on marketing, right? For this start, 30% of revenue for the marketing expense. So this one you can really get a glimpse, or get a lot of data using your historical financial margins, and how much of the expenses or percentage of expenses you've used in projects before. Okay. Okay. And then just one tip is, as I said, because if you do have the historical data, make sure you don't, the biggest thing is just don't guess. Make sure that you use your past projects and your financials to model pricing for future proposals, right? Because knowledge is key. If you have all that data, just make sure you don't guess. All right. Okay. So now, so before, we've been doing questions here and there, but before I go to the next section, I wanted to make sure there are no other questions that I've missed or that I can answer right now. So I'll just give you, just a few seconds to post down your questions if you have any right now before I go to the next section. Okay. So do I see? Okay. So now let's go to section 4. Section 4 would be, what are the best practices when preparing your budget? And these are just, just a compilation of the stuff I've done. And I know some of them just, more of, very, very simple. And it seems like it's um, something that should be a no-brainer. But sometimes the simple ones are the ones that we miss because we think they're so simple. So it's not necessarily in the front of our mind. So first one is making sure that you start with the scope of work and that you work backwards, right? So we earlier in the beginning we talked about how budgeting is a narrative. Budgeting is a combination of a narrative and the numbers. So you have to have the numbers, but then you also have a narrative of where the numbers come from. But the numbers also are coming in from the scope of work. So make sure you start and begin budgeting only after you've clearly outlined what work will be performed in your proposal. So what work do you need, right? And then each task in your scope of work should translate into line items in your budget. So just to give you an example, if your scope of work includes I'm going to do training sessions or I'm going to do workshops. So make sure you explicitly budget the things that you will need to accomplish that scope of work, such as what is the trainer time, the materials, the space, the refreshments if allowed, and then also the outreach. So as you can see, we start with this because if you don't have the scope of work clearly outlined, how are you going to know that your budget will be accurate, right? And so what you can do is reverse engineer the budget. So break down the project into milestones or phases, and then ask, what resources do I need to deliver for each part? So this is a very simple, I think, and clear way to make sure that you don't miss any part of your budget. Because you say, okay, so what I need is they need me to do scope of work 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So for each milestone or each scope, you ask yourself, okay, how do I do this? How do I accomplish this task? What resources will I need to deliver? Okay. Yes, so just and before I continue, yes, thank you for this comment. Please note that you can use the Public Records Act in order to secure a copy of the last winning proposal to determine what the former contractor bid budget was. Yes. So as I mentioned before, there is that Freedom of Information Act that you can use. So let's say if there was a proposal that you have seen before in the past, let's say proposal is something that occurs every year or every couple of years. So check. So let's say you go on Ramp LA, you see that proposal, right? You can see, and then there is a function or a filter saying open ones. So you can look at the ones and and then expand the search to include the filter to closed proposals. And then if you see a closed proposal that is similar to that one, then you can go and request to secure the copy of that proposal. Yeah, so this is, yes, and so this one also is helpful for one of the questions here. What if you are a startup without any historical data? So you can use the last winning proposal. And then what you can do is you can also look at online. There are some industry reports that you can use that will give you the examples of what the operating margins would be, or what your expense margins would be. So for example, I've done a lot of business valuations in the past, and then when I've looked at valuations, and what you do is you normalize what the margins are. So let's say, you're a marketing company, and then you wanted to see what would be just give you a quick example. What would be the typical website or tech fees, right? Tech expenses that a marketing agency like me would use. So there are actually sources right there online that are based on industry. So there's an industry analysis one that there's some resources, and I will send you some resources later that give you some information on the industry. And of course, there's some industries that are not, like, can you imagine an industry in AI? They may not have that much data yet. So one thing that I do use is that if that data is, let's say it's AI, right? Something that you may not necessarily have historical data on, because because it's a fairly new industry. What I like to do is to just find the industry that is mostly comparable to yours, or a combination, right? So for example, for AI, I mean, honestly, I think maybe the most comparable to it would be something in tech or tech services. And unfortunately, it's something that is not 100% accurate, but I think you can get a really good guesstimate based on the industry or comparable industries that you have. Okay. Okay, so that's the first best practice. Second one would be, what are some tips for estimating hours, rates, and escalation? Because this is the one that we talked about earlier. A question on, the number of hours, right? How do I know that my number of hours are accurate? So that's something that's hard to estimate. So hours, make sure that you base it on estimates on realistic time frames. So so if you do have past projects, make sure that you use that. And I know that someone had asked, oh, what if I'm a startup and this is something I've never done before? So there are some industry, like industry data that you can use actually. For example, on the top of my head, there is an industry tool or database that you can use called IBIS World. So IBIS World. And that one has all the different industries that you can gather at this moment in time. And then it will give you the industry, it will give you a lot of data on margins. So unfortunately, like IBIS World, you have to pay for. However, one thing I have found is that IBIS World is usually open and available for free in libraries, especially those that are college libraries. So what you can do is, let's say you can go to your nearest college library, look up IBIS World, IBIS World, and then they will give you, and then look up at the industry, and it will give you the data for free. So that's one thing that you can say, okay, let's say for a construction company of this size, and then for this scope and this project, what would be the historical industry data? So you can also use, as I mentioned, the time tracking tool. We talked about Clockify, which is my favorite, but there's some other ones, or even calendars, right? So that's a way to estimate the time. Rates. So using actual pay rates or reasonable market-based rates, including fringe if applicable. So as I mentioned earlier, some resources to look for reasonable market-based rates would be the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which has it could give you, I think this one is a bit more general with regards to the type of job, the job title. You can look at, or you can look at salary.com, and it will give you, as I mentioned earlier as well, it can give you data even broken down by industry. I'm sorry, not just industry, but also broken down by geographic location. Okay. And the third one is escalation. So if your project spans more than 1 year, so how do you do the annual increases to account for the inflation or wage increase? So one of the things I've used before when I've been doing projections is that you use inflation costs. And so, for example, inflation cost has been between 3 to 5%. There may be some industries that inflation would be, or, different locations per industry will be a little bit higher. So it's say inflation rate here in the US would be different from an inflation rate somewhere in Latin America. But generally what I've seen would be inflation rate as a general increase would be about 3 to 5%. About now it's about 4 to 5% a year. So you can use that to account for inflation or wage increases for those proposals that you've seen that are multi-year. So, one of the tips that I also put is, as I said, kind of like similar to before, don't guess. So make sure you check your internal pay records if you've done so, if you've done specific projects in the past, and then also use past contracts. Also use the past contracts, not just your contracts, but also contracts you can get through the Freedom of Information Act. And then also use wage data. So this is the one I'm talking about, Bureau of Labor Statistics. So you can go to bls.gov for wage data, and then also salary.com. And then also be consistent in applying the rates across a budget, and then round sensibly. As you can see, it just makes the numbers a little bit easier. Would you please? Yes. So let's see. Someone had asked. Yes. So someone had asked about some of the apps and then the resources. Yeah, I'm gonna just type in. So it's IBIS World, IBIS World. So that is the the one to get industry data. I really, really like IBIS World. There's some other ones, but IBIS World will give you so many breakdowns of the industry. Not only the industry, it also gives you the breakdown on some geographic locations. And then it also does it per year. So it gives you a lot of back years for historical data. And then also they have the most current years as well. And then, but what I did mention is the IBIS, they're called IBIS World Reports. They're very expensive. However, one workaround that I've found was that you can go to your local library and then access IBIS World for free. So, for example, just to give you a heads up, Cal State Fullerton has a really good library, and I've been able to use IBIS World there. All you need is just your library card, and then you can get really expensive reports for free. Okay. So, Paul, before I continue, what do you usually use to determine hourly rates in your proposals? Or is it your current payroll, industry norms, or is it a flat guess? So on the chat, if you wanted to put down what you've used, if you've had, if you've done a proposal before, yeah, I'd be curious to know yeah, current payroll. So current payroll is the most, obviously it's if your current payroll is at the market rate, then yes. I guess that's one thing I forgot to mention, or I should have mentioned, is that your payroll would be a great suggestion to get this information if your payroll is at the market rent, right? If your hourly rates actually reflect what the current market rates are, whether you're overpaying or underpaying, right? But you want to make sure that it is fair market that would affect your budget. Industry norms, yes. Yeah, industry norms, and then current payroll. So it's always great when you have that data to look into. Okay. So another best practices is how to justify costs with narrative explanations. So one big tip is that don't guess. So make sure that oh, okay. Actually, that one is a different. There you go. Yeah, so how to justify costs with narrative explanation. So make sure that every significant line item should have some sort of short explanation or footnote. So this is often called the cost narrative. So I think this is very important because think of it as if you are a reader, and you're looking at all these different proposals. First of all, I want to make sure that there's transparency in what the budgets are. And second, I just wanted, what you want to do is just to make it as easy as possible for someone who's reviewing it. So think of it as when you're looking at your budget, is step back or have someone write it, have someone look at it and say, hey, you know what? This is my budget. Do you have any questions? Does everything make sense? So if they question something like, oh, is this expense? What is this expense? Then you know that your proposer may have the same question, right? So reviewers want to see not just what you're spending on, but also why it's reasonable and necessary. So use clear, specific language. Avoid vague explanations like staff time or general support. So you want to make sure, even just for your purpose. I mean, I forget a lot of stuff all the time, so I want to make sure, if I don't write it down, I'll forget what it is. So I just want to make sure that, if you can put as much information in your footnote, or just, either make sure that it's transparent on your budget, or if you can only put, maybe a few words or so, then make sure you can put your notes somewhere else. So then if the proposer does come back to you and say, hey, you know what, I have a question with this, you have something to look back into. Okay. So then how to use historical data and then cost benchmark. So this is another thing, right, that people have a hard time on. Looking at your own past projects, so we've talked about that, looking at your past project budgets, actual costs, or even invoices for similar projects to estimate accurately. So it doesn't have to be, sometimes it's very hard to find a project that exactly addresses what you have. However, if you can justify a similar service, then you can use that as an estimate, and then you can do a plus or minus margin based on that one, right? So you can say, oh, okay, I think this one will be, let's say it's $100, but if you use maybe a 5%, cushion on that one, then because there may be something a little bit different from the service that you're proposing in right now. So then that one would be a great way to look at historical data adjustment. And then researching industry benchmarks, labor costs, or per unit supply, or then travel costs. So we've talked about that one. IBIS World is a good one. And then I know there's some other ones. I don't use them. However, I will, when I send out the slides and a follow-up email, I'll include some of those resources. And then for the labor costs, we talked about, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and salary.com. And then use public records of awarded contracts. So this one, as we've mentioned before, you can use the Public Information Freedom of Information Act to see which ones have won that proposal before. If there was a similar proposal, which was the winning proposal, then you can look at the budget as some sort of context. And then you can also look at usaspending.com or some other local procurement portal to see how similar work was priced. Okay, so now let's go on to the next poll because these polls are fun. I wanted it's fun for me to know what people are thinking. What sources do you rely on when you're not sure how much to charge or budget for something? So if you do have any sources that I've mentioned that you've used, or if there are other sources, so for example, salary sources and stuff like that, hourly rates that you've used, yeah, feel free to share with us on the chat. Chat GTP, yes. Yes, that's always a good one, right? So, but even Chat GTP, if you do, Chat GTP, and if you say, let's say labor rates, right? So, I want to know the labor rates for something, and then you can actually prompt the Chat GTP to say, okay, give me that, and give me the precise what the precise source is. Is this from BLS.com, salary.com, or anything like that? So then at least you can go to the original source. Okay, and then for someone else, other chefs and restaurateurs, and then AI, yes. Select information from potential partners, yes. These are great suggestions. I think about what life was without Chat GTP and AI, and you don't realize that that was just a year, about a year, 2 years ago when we didn't have that, right? So, but it's been a great source of resource, and then also making sure that one of the things that when I use it, I always say, what is this, and give me live, actually this is what I prompted, is I say give me the live links to these information, so it give you the links to each information. So thank you for your suggestions. So then the other one would be aligning your budget with your proposal's technical narrative, looking at your own past projects, actual costs. We've talked about that one. Okay. And then these are just some checklists for alignment. So are all key personnel, just a few things, before you submit the proposal, um, is that, first of all, do they align, right? Does your budget align with your proposal's narrative? So first thing is, are all key personnel are they both included in the narrative and the project in the budget? So for example, if part of your narrative is that let's say, let's go back to the marketing agency, and then you're budgeting 40% of your budget for a website. Make sure that you include that personnel for the website, and make sure that you include that budget proposal description in your narrative, right? So making sure that the alignment is there. Are all major deliverables reflected in the direct costs? If your main deliverable is, I don't know, a building, make sure that every, the materials and then the labor costs are reflected as a direct cost. Our travel, training, any equipment reference consistently across sections, are they also included in your narrative? So this is another suggestion that I have. So let's say if you have a budget, and if 50%, what you can do is you can put a percentage. Let's say you have 5 or 6 items in your budget. And let's say, if marketing expenses are 60% of your total expenses, make sure you include that one, and make sure you dedicate as much narrative to that one as possible, because obviously it's going to be a big part of your expense, right? And then you can just go there. And I think that's a really easy way to figure out that you don't miss describing a lot of the budget items in your narrative. And then just a quick show of hands, or a quick thing on the chat, is what part of your narrative is most expensive to deliver, and is that reflected clearly on your budget? So for example, I talked about, let's say when you have your proposal, and the most expensive one is that, oh gosh, you have to deliver this website costs so much because it's complicated and difficult and extensive. And do you reflect that in your budget? So in your own business, what has been the most expensive part of what encompasses a biggest part of your expenses, and do you accurately put that in the narrative? Yes, so just a quick here, looking back. Yes, IBIS World as for marketing research. Yes. Okay. Okay, so going on, so before I get out of the best practices and then go to the last section, I wanted to just do a quick check and making sure that you guys have any other questions. I don't see anything else. I think I've been um top team. Okay. So someone had mentioned here, I think from the poll earlier, what was the biggest part of and I think this is the one where you're probably a restaurateur, prep time and service. Yeah, so each industry, right? So each industry has their own categories of expenses that you spend the most money on. So I think if you do your market research, especially with IBIS World or something similar, is you'll find out across industries what are the most extensive expenses, and then you check yours and say, oh, okay, well, how come am I in line with industry standards or norms, or am I not? So If you are, then okay. But then if you're not, that doesn't mean it's bad. Maybe because you offer something that's slightly different than industry norm. But at the very least, is that you can get some sort of context of how far you are from industry norms. Because I always think of it as from the perspective of someone who is looking at these proposals and reading them and saying, okay, are there just red flags, which is what we'll talk about shortly? Are there red flags or are there things that stick out? And if they stick out, I want to know why they stick out, and I want to know if there's an explanation for it if I was the proposer. So, okay, so some red flags that I've seen. And we talked about this earlier, underpricing or overpricing labor. So underpricing labor may make your proposal look unrealistic. So let's say if a proposal will take someone realistically within the range of 50 hours, but you're proposing that you're gonna take 30 hours, I would, as someone who's reading the proposal, I would take a step back and say, whoa, why is it taking them 40% less in order to perform the same type of labor, right? And then reviewers may question. So reviewers may question whether you understand the scope, the complete scope, or you can deliver within the budget. And then overpricing, on the other hand, may make you not competitive or seem inflated, especially without if you're not if you're not justifying why there's overpricing in labor. So make sure you aim for a reasonable, well-supported rate using, as we mentioned before, your actual payroll data, market benchmarks, and then also job classifications when available. And then also tips. So if you charge $20 an hour for a $50 hour job, you may win the contract, but may lose money trying to deliver it. Or you may be able to sustain it for 1 year, but if it's a multi-year contract, and although you may get to negotiate it later on, right? I don't, no one wants to lose money on a contract if, just because you may have underpriced some expenses. Yeah, so I like this comment. So don't forget that you need to submit a competitive bid budget against other qualified bidders in your industry. Yes. So, that's why we always talk about it in the terms of context, right? So you're not the only one who will be submitting these bid proposals. So you are competing against a labor pool, or, some sort of like bidder pool. And this bidder pool, I'm assuming that for most of them, it will be industry standard and it will be some sort of range. And so if you are outside of that range, be prepared to have someone look at it and then also say, okay, well, is it over or under? Right. So it's really important to make sure that you do a lot of this research, whether historically within your company or using industry. Here, missing indirect costs. So that's another red flag. So many businesses, especially those smaller ones, forget to include the indirect or overhead costs like rent, admin, utilities, or insurance. So even if, let's say, oh, but utilities will only take, let's say, a couple dollars, right? Couple dollars will add up though if it's a big enough project, and also if it's a multi-year one. So make sure that you include, most of I would say, especially the small ones that are indirect or overhead. And if you don't have a federally negotiated rate, you may be able to apply a 10% de minimis rate to eligible direct costs. So yeah, so this is the thing so for example, even if you say you don't have indirect costs, I would say there are some things that you may be missing. So I would always put some sort of cushion, a de minimis rate or a minimal rate in order to make sure that you capture everything. And then leaving out indirect costs could mean that you're unintentionally subsidizing the contract, so you're subsidizing portion of it because you're not getting paid for that one. Oops, excuse me. Okay, so another red flag would be not justifying the subcontractor or consultant fee. So if you include subcontractor or outside consultants, make sure that you explain their role, their cost, and their value. And this could be for many, many of you, right? So let's say if you are a prime who have subcontractors, or if you're working with other subcontractors as well, or if a prime says, hey, can you give me, your cost and your value and your role, right? So this is something that's important all throughout. Government reviewers want the transparency. Who are they? Who are your subcontractors? Why they're necessary? And are their rates fair? So some of them, you may not necessarily have the name of the subcontractor, because you may yeah, you may not just have that much of a transparency, or you don't know yet, but try to get as much information as you can on and describe the type of subcontracting work that they'll be doing. So then, it gives a little bit more transparency to, to the section. And so some RFPs may require letters of commitment, some sort of rate sheet or resumes for subcontractors. Okay. And then another red flag would be misalignment. So misalignment between the budget and the technical proposal. So one of the things I hope that when the biggest takeaway that I can take with this one, if I was listening to this presentation, is making sure that you align the budget and then also the narrative, right? And I go back to the original slide where we talk about narrative plus numbers. So we're making sure that there's an alignment between the narrative and then also the numbers that you're presenting. So one of the top reasons that proposals are rejected is because there's inconsistency between the budget and the write-up, right? So I always want to make sure that that you look at both, do the budget and then do the write-up. Before submitting, read the proposal and then the budget side by side and ask yourself, does every major activity, role, or resource appear in both? Especially the ones where, as I said, if it's 50 or 60% of your budget, take a step back and say, did I write enough about it? Did I give enough transparency to it? And did I give enough description to it? So I think that's the end. So with that said, I just wanted to make sure I answer all your questions. Yes, so thank you for this comment. Don't forget to red flag if this award is the lowest bid or the bid value contract. Yes. Okay, so just couple of logistics. I think I've answered all the questions, but if you do have more questions, I would like I'd like to hear from you. So if you wanted to go and email me any of your questions, and then also you can also call me. Oops. Let me go back to that one. Oop. There you go. Let me go back to the slideshow. There you go. There you go. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, and I'm gonna mention again, PACE is a nonprofit organization. So what we do is we offer our services free of charge, because we run off of government grants. So if you have any questions about this with procurement, make sure you reach out to me or Andrew, who is another procurement counselor that we have on staff. I see him on the comments. He's been providing great information on the chat. Reach out to one of us, or if you reach out to me, and then I'll chime in and have Andrew take a look at some of them as well. We can help you with your procurement questions. We can help you with your budget. And Andrew was the one who did last week's information or our session on proposals for professional services. So make sure that you get the recording as well. And what I'll do is I will do a follow-up after this. I will do a follow-up with the slides, the link to last year's recording or last week's recording, and then also my contact information. So with that said, I want to make sure I do one last check. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate you for always joining the webinars. And my goal is really to make this webinar simple and easy to understand. Just because if there are in general, right? Because if you do have specific questions, you reach out to me or you reach out to Andrew and say, hey, you know what? I have a very specific situation, right? So for example, oh my God, I can't find the labor rate on this, or I can't find some information on this. Then we can do some additional research. But I want to make this as general, as simple, and as quick for people to grasp. So you can have, a good takeaway when you're doing those proposals. So with that said, thank you so much, everyone. I always appreciate your time. I know that your time is precious, so I appreciate that you spend the over hour webinar with us. And then next week, we're going to be talking about loans and money. And I think Jennifer may be here. I think, let's see. Yes. So she's going to be the one presenting next week's session. So you'll be hearing from her and then the ways to access money. So with that, thank you so much, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. And as I said, make sure you reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you.